Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's been said that if you get 10 nutritionists in a room, you'll get 20 different opinions. And this is the 21st opinion that you'll get today. One of the remarkable things about calcium is that the biggest study ever done in this country, the Harvard Nurses Study, included 77,000 nurses, very large study, and it went over 12 years. It was published in the American Journal of Public Health in 1997, and it found that the women who consumed the most calcium in food, which was predominantly dairy products, had the most hip fractures, 45% more hip fractures over 12 years than the women who consumed the least calcium in food. And they consumed virtually zero dairy products. In other words, 450 milligrams a day or less of calcium from food, and that meant once a week a serving of milk or 2 servings of cheese, and that amounted to a very tiny amount every day for those who consumed the most, and others zero dairy products. Those who consumed intermediate amounts, lest people be tempted to compromise. Well, a little bit can't be bad, I got to get some calcium. Those who consumed between 450 and 900 milligrams a day, which approaches the recommended amount, had between roughly 20 and 30% more hip fractures than those who consumed virtually no dairy products. Here's a mnemonic that was taught in medical school. A friend of mine who's a medical doctor told me about this, and he had done his undergraduate research in Harvard for his senior thesis on calcium. So he was very interested in the subject, and he remembered this mnemonic. And these are the symptoms of too much calcium. And it turns out they're very accurate, and that we're probably getting too much calcium today by following the recommended allowances. Moans, pain, in other words, groans, same thing, stones, kidney, gallstones, fragile bones, prone to fracture, and psychiatric overtones, depression, irritability, things like that. Mark Hegstead was professor of nutrition at Harvard, and he published an article in the Journal of Nutrition in 1986 in which he said, populations with high calcium intakes, mainly from dairy products, have the highest hip fracture rates. So it's not just this Harvard Nurses Study, it's a number of other studies. Here's what he said. It seems quite clear that we do not understand the etiology of osteoporosis. The epidemiological data need an explanation, and something is wrong when current explanations are inconsistent with general experience. It is dangerous to ignore the epidemiological data. The first rule in formulating public health policy should be the assurance that the recommendations are not detrimental. It will be embarrassing enough if the current calcium hype is simply useless. It will be immeasurably worse if the recommendations are actually detrimental to health. And I think that's what we're seeing. Here is a man who grew up on a dairy farm, believed all the conventional hype about calcium and milk. He was professor of nutritional biochemistry at Cornell University. He's now emeritus. This is a 1997 interview. This is after he had spent 10 years in China that completely contradicted his experience and training, not his experience, but his training with regard to nutrition and calcium. The US and other Western industrialized countries have the highest fracture rates, whereas rural China and other non-industrialized countries have the lowest fracture rates. Studies that have compared fracture rates in different countries against calcium intake have found that the higher the calcium intake, the higher the fracture rate. Finally, when you compare dairy food intake against fracture rates, the higher the dairy food intake, the higher the fracture rates. In other words, it's exactly the opposite of what the National Dairy Council says. The U.S. recommended daily or dietary allowances for calcium by the National Institutes of Health. So we're talking about amounts generally for adults of 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams, all in the range or above the range of those who had the highest hip fracture rates in the Harvard nurses and other studies. The World Health Organization recommends 500 for children, 800 a day for adults. Even that is not justified by the research. Authorities disagree, and I think authority is not as good as science. When you're trying to find out the truth about science, you need to go to the evidence and not just rely on authorities. I have cited a few authorities, however, but they must be taken with a grain of salt. Some say the RDAs are too high and are not supported by the evidence. Walter Willett, chairman of the Harvard Nutrition Department. T. Colin Campbell, professor emeritus of nutrition at Cornell University, the one I mentioned, raised on a dairy farm. Marion Nestle, chairman of nutrition at NYU. And the late Mark Hegstead, whom I quoted earlier. Other prominent experts stand by the current RDAs. Professor Heaney of Creighton University, and I believe he's modified his views somewhat just in the last few years since I first took these quotes. Beth Dawson Hughes, past president of the National Osteoporosis Foundation. So here's an example of where authority is something you got to be wary of. I've already mentioned this. The Harvard Nurses Study was very large with 77,000 American nurses. One of the points about it at the bottom here is that 98% of the women were white. So we're not talking about other non-white populations who may be allergic and intolerant of lactose, for example. We're talking about Scandinavians, Northern Europeans. This is the publication in 1997, and it was done by the Harvard School of Nutrition and Public Health. These are the results I quoted earlier. Over 900 milligrams a day of calcium, greater than or equal to 2 glasses of milk per day equivalent, 45% more hip fractures than the fourth quartile who consume virtually 0, and here are the other categories. They had 5% more forearm fractures, which is interesting. They had more, but it wasn't as great. I'm not sure of the exact reasons for that. The next group was 626 to 900 milligrams, 23% more hip fractures. Third group, 36 more hip fractures, and they had just a little more. You know, these are the ones taking a little bit more, 36, a third more hip fractures. And then finally, less than or equal to 450 milligrams a day of calcium, less than 1 glass of milk per week on the average.
Earl,
yes?
Could you put some numbers to the fourth quartile so that we have some sense of the percentages you're speaking about? So out of the 12,000 women, how many in that fourth quartile had hip fractures?
Okay. 77,000 women. Okay. The first quartile was 1/4 of those women. Each quartile is 1/4 of the women. And they were all registered nurses, and presumably when they were asked to report their dietary consumption, they were responsible about it. They knew how important that was. A good confirming study, 1994 Australian study, 209 subjects, 207 controls in the Sydney area. This group was somewhat older than the other group, but still in the age range that you'd be concerned about hip fractures. They divide them up into 5 groups, and the 20% with the highest milk product consumption had about 50% more hip fractures than the 20% who consumed the least. That was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. And then there was a British Medical Journal study in 2011 with 61,000 subjects and conducted over 19 years in Sweden. The conclusion was that taking more than 750 milligrams a day was not helpful. But what they didn't do, and that a responsible researcher or researchers should have done, was break down the amount of consumption because of the Harvard nurses study between 450 milligrams or less and more than that. But they didn't. They left that group as just 750 or less. And it prevented them from finding that indeed those who don't take more than 450 milligrams a day probably have the best results.
Earl, in the second item, what is 11.5 units per week? Is that 11 times a week? And how much are they consuming each time?
The units, I think it was comparable to the Harvard study. A glass of milk was a unit, and cheese has about half as much per volume. Again, Dr. Campbell, he did a study of women in 65 rural Chinese counties in 1991. Mean calcium intake was 544 milligrams a day. These are women who don't consume milk products in most of the groups. They did a number of rural locations. Bone fracture rate was only 1/5 as much as in the United States. In other words, 5 times more bone fractures in American women than in Chinese women. Now there are other factors. Maybe they get outdoors more, maybe they get more exercise. Those are important factors too. But calcium is a very significant factor. What about bone mineral density? In a related China study of 764 women aged 35 to 75, most of the women consumed no milk products. They had lost low bone mineral density, less than 0.325 grams per centimeter, which the authors thought placed them at high risk for fracture. Nonetheless, the women were healthy, with no signs of osteoporosis such as back pain or dowager's hump. Less than 4% had a type of wrist fracture and other fractures suspected to be related to osteoporosis in their lifetime, much less than in Western countries. This suggests that the bone mineral density tests are not reliable. This was consistent with other studies showing that the incidence rate of hip fracture was much higher in those countries where bone density was reported to be high. Why is that? Here's the limitation on these tests. The most common test, which some of you may have had, how many have had a bone mineral density test? It's a 2-dimensional test, and it measures fairly accurately, but it's measuring a thin slice going through the bone. Think of it this way. If the bone is much wider, but porous, it's porous, but it's a thicker bone, you may have more total matter in it, and it's going to show more bone density, because it's not really measuring the density at a particular location, but the total amount of matter over that diameter. And there's some evidence that when a bone is not getting the nutrients it needs, the body makes it wider to try to make it stronger. And this may explain why the Chinese had lower bone mineral density and all these other studies, but had stronger bones. This is a restaurant I went to in Austin, Texas, that was serving chicken, very naturally raised chicken, outdoors and so forth. And one of the very interesting things about that chicken was the bones were a lot thinner than most chicken you get these days, commercially raised in these gigantic factory hen houses where they don't get outdoors at all. And not sure exactly how they fed these chickens at this restaurant, but the bones were very thin. And even the ends of the bones were much smaller than these ones. But I couldn't break it. It was like steel. It was extraordinary. And I'm sure you've all seen that the usual chicken bones are thicker than that, and they break very easily, both at the ends and in the middle. And that's an illustration of this problem we're talking about here. Some other elements that really do help make stronger bones. Magnesium is one of them, silicon is another, and potassium is a third. And in this study by Dr. Abraham and another physician, both medical doctors, it was a small study, but they gave more magnesium than calcium. Think of this, milk contains about 8 times more calcium than magnesium. And that's why it creates this big imbalance. They gave 600 milligrams of magnesium, 500 of calcium and other nutrients, and there was an 11% gain in bone density. Now, I don't think the width of the bone, the diameter, increased by that much, but rather the bone itself. I can't prove that, but at least that's a remarkable finding. And this is the healed bone, versus 0.7% in controls. So that's about a 15-fold advantage in favor of those who got the magnesium that exceeded the calcium. And they didn't provide silicon in that, strontium, which actually helps make stronger bones, or vitamin K. Most studies of high calcium intake, although they claim this is good, show a decline in the rate of bone loss. But they're still getting bone loss in those studies. That ought to be a red flag that this isn't the real solution. And when you compare it with the Abraham study, you could see there may be a very big difference. And here's some so-called anecdotal evidence, but it's so remarkable. Sometimes anecdotes are good evidence because it defeats the odds so enormously. I have had occasion to counsel a professor of dance at the University of Texas when I lived in Austin, Texas. She went to the same Unitarian church I did, a very bright lady, and one day I saw her in a wheelchair, and I hadn't seen her for months. I said, "What happened to you?" I said, "Well, I was in an auto accident and my tibia was fractured. And well, why are you still in a wheelchair?" Well, she said this was 4 months ago. And she said, "Well, doctor says I'm not healing at all." And after 4 months, she still could not put any weight on her leg. So I told her about my experience and study of calcium and bones, and how I mentioned that, "Are you familiar with the herb horsetail, which is high in silicon?" She said, "No, I haven't heard of that." And so I said, "I recommend that you take that. I also recommend you take some magnesium, maybe 400, 500 milligrams a day." And I asked her if she was taking calcium. She said, "Oh yes, the doctor said I should take 1,000 or 1,200 a day. Are you doing that?" "Yes, I'm taking the calcium." And I said, "Well, cut back in that." And so she cut way back to 400 or 500. And so she's getting as much magnesium and now getting silica. And I talked to her a week later by phone, and I said, "How are you doing?" She said, "You won't believe this. It's a miracle every day. I'm already able to walk with a walker. I can put weight on my legs, in other words, after just 7 days." And the result was that she progressed very rapidly. Okay, that's another person, but a week later, or 2 weeks later, she was walking with a 4-prong cane, no longer the conventional walker. 3 weeks later, she's walking with a regular cane, and then 6 weeks later, it's like she's healed. She's driving her car and back to normal. 6 weeks, cutting back, way back in calcium, and taking magnesium and silica, and she went 4 months with zero healing, taking this high calcium. It's an anecdote, but as I said, and there's more recognition now that studies of one, if you have a person and you have something you can turn on and off like a faucet in that person, that's more important than a study that averages out a lot of individual differences and maybe produces inconclusive results. The question is how you react to something. And that's why sometimes an anecdote can be more than just the conventional characterization of them. This is a woman aged 24 with a history of scoliosis. She had a steel rod put in her spine as a teenager. She had congenitally low estrogen. So in effect, she was postmenopausal from birth. And so she wasn't able to form bones properly. And she was also in an auto accident, and she had no healing going on 2 months after the accident. So I talked to her. Okay, we'll go back here. I talked to her about cutting back in calcium, taking magnesium, and the herb horsetail, which is high in silica, has negligible calcium. And she did it. And she told me that the next day was the first day after the accident that she was pain-free. the first day after she made this change. Her father was a personal injury trial lawyer and was used to using the best orthopedist in Houston. I knew her because she was a law student where I had a job with the City of Austin Legal Department at the time, and I was doing nutrition counseling on the side while working on my Ph.D. And she, a Ph.D. in nutrition, I should say. And she had such rapid healing showing up on her successive x-rays when she went to her doctor in Houston that he said, "This is a miracle. I've never seen anything like this." Okay? And she was completely healed in 6 weeks. That's after 2 months with zero healing. So again, this is the type of experience that's very significant. I was in a head-on collision in 1995, so I had a chance to test these ideas myself. And by the way, I first learned about this silicon idea in 1975 and was very struck by it because I read these books and I said, there are all kinds of studies here reporting this phenomenon, this rather remarkable phenomenon, who had never heard of this theory that I'll get into in a little bit of biological transmutations and what may actually be happening. But I had 3 ribs that were fractured in a head-on collision. And one of the ribs, the 2 ends weren't touching at all. And they don't set them at all in that situation. They just expect you to heal. And I followed my own advice, took horsetail and magnesium. I don't consume milk products. I knew enough by then. And 4 weeks later, I was able to play a 1-hour game of racquetball at almost full speed. And I wasn't at my very best, but then 5 weeks later, I played again and I was basically at 100%. And to the discouragement of my opponent, who was a medical doctor. You saw the thing about wrist, but this woman, an 80-year-old woman, was actually my mother-in-law, so I knew her quite well, but she was not healing after several months from a wrist fracture. And I gave her the same advice, and she had the same results of rapid healing of her wrist fracture. Louis Kervran is a French biologist who first came up with the theory of biological transmutations. And he recalled an experience as a child where the chickens in the yard who were laying eggs, one day they're laying eggs that no longer have hard shells. Okay? And they found that they put mica dust or chips just in a pile on the ground. And these chickens would dive into it, gobble it up like crazy, roll in it. They were ecstatic to have this mica dust. Well, mica has a lot of silica in it, like potassium silicate. It's got potassium in it. Negligible, if any, calcium. And the next day, the chickens would lay eggs with hard shells again. And he just, stored that experience in the back of his mind when he was wrestling with a problem I'll tell you about in a couple minutes here. And then Kervran also raises the issue of there's bone. When a chicken is hatching an egg, there's already a significant amount of calcium in the bones. But if you examine the egg, calcium isn't there. There is some silicon in the membrane, and that's where he thinks the calcium is coming from, a transmutation, actually. And regarding the horsetail, the herb is generally very safe. However, some are allergic to it. It contains an enzyme thiominase, which breaks down thiamine, B1, and can cause a deficiency of B1. So I think it's best to take a B supplement or B1 when taking horsetail, at least if you take large amounts over a long period of time. You can also get silica that has the thiominase removed. And here is x-rays that were taken from a study with rats. This is after 10 days. Down here it says 10th day, action of vegetal silica, horsetail. He used the herb horsetail. And this is Louis Kervran, the French biologist, for recalcification, the broken femurs of rats. On the 10th day after the fracture, those who got the horsetail with the silica are shown at the bottom. The ones who got calcium are shown here. So you see some healing there, and you see virtually none in this other rat. You see this has a more solid connection here in this rat, and in this rat it's already completely healed after 10 days. Everybody's different, so the rate at which people heal will vary. And here we are after 17 days. 2 is apparently no further along than it was, maybe less healed than it was on the 10th day. Still a significant gap here. Something is missing. And on the 17th day here, we not only have complete healing, but it is darker in the area of the break than in the rest of the bone. In other words, this bone has become stronger at the break than in the rest of the bone. And this one is completely healed. Again, very slightly darker. That was a study done by Louis Kervran, the French biologist. Why the paradox? Why does low calcium make bones strong and high calcium make bones weak? The hard proportion of bones is 99% calcium phosphate. For some reason, we don't have to worry much about the phosphorus. That seems to take care of itself, so we won't worry about it. It's called hydroxyapatite, for those who have an appetite for technological terms. Claude Bernard was a French physiologist, and he said, when one is confronted with a fact which is in opposition with a prevalent theory, one must accept this fact and abandon the theory, even though the latter, supported by great men, may be generally subscribed to. And how often, because of disbelief, is just the opposite done, especially by scientists. A footnote here, Bernard made this statement about bacteria. He knew Louis Pasteur, and he said, the real problem isn't the bacteria, it's he called it the terrain, but the biochemistry of the individual. Said the answer is the terrain, not the microbe. And Pasteur disagreed with him. And this went on for years. When Pasteur died, his last words were, Bernard was right. The terrain is really important. Edith Carlisle was a very fine nutrition researcher at UCLA School of Public Health. And she did several studies with silicon. And she said there was a unique localization of silicon in active calcification sites in young bone. And the question was, why is silica there? What is it doing? Subsequent in vivo, this is in living beings with rats, demonstrated that dietary silicon increases the rate of mineralization, particularly under conditions of low calcium intake. Her study was cited more than almost any other study. It was very widely read, and yet people in the mainstream areas didn't pay enough attention to it. Calcium versus vitamin D and thyroid. Calcium actually reduces the level of the active vitamin D, form of vitamin D. In the kidney, proto-vitamin D is actually converted into the active form. And one of the problems with calcium may be that it blocks that conversion. Calcium also interferes with thyroid function. And Kervran makes a good case in his books and published articles that thyroid hormones, some of which no one knew the function of. There's this, 38% of thyroid hormones is this hormone that no one knew what it did, but they really hadn't tested whether it might play a role as a catalyst in these conversions, like silica plus We'll get to that. But silica plus carbon, the atomic numbers add up to calcium, and the atomic weights match up. And that is actually Kervran's theory. So where does calcium come from? Louis Kervran is on the left here. Dr. Hisatoki Komaki was a Ph.D. microbiologist and professor of microbiology in Japan. He did confirming studies that supported that, and they were both nominated for the Nobel Prize. And according to a now deceased professor of philosophy at Colorado State University, it had been decided to award them the Nobel Prize, but in a last-minute maneuver, they didn't get it. I think it was too revolutionary for the Nobel Committee, which we know is influenced somewhat by commercial and important political interests. So they didn't get it, but they were nominated for it in 1975, and their theory is called biological transmutations. It was Kervran here who first published it. And here's how he first did that. But first we'll have a nice quote from another Nobel laureate. It is premature, this is from Louis de Broglie, 1929 Nobel laureate in physics. It is premature to want to assess vital, that is, in living organisms, processes according to the very insufficient biochemical concepts of the 19th or even the 20th century, like nuclear physics, some of the theories about nuclear physics. And then Leon Brion, an eminent French-US physicist, readily admitted that not all laws of biochemistry deduced from experiments performed on dead matter are necessarily true with regard to living matter. And it makes sense that if you're going to draw conclusions that something is impossible in living matter, the experiment should be performed on living matter. And I've talked to physicists who say, oh, this is impossible. And I say, but don't you think the experiment should be performed on living matter? They don't get it. The first real proof Kervran had of a biological transmutation, it resulted from repeated carbon monoxide poisonings, often resulting in death. And he, as an official with the French Health Department, would investigate these in detail, and they never found any source of carbon monoxide in the air. And so they would close the case as a mystery. Same thing happened in Germany and France, and the United States had the same experience. Here are the facts. These were all oxyacetylene torch welders. It heats iron to a very high temperature, 1100 centigrade. That's 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The melting point is 2700 degrees, so we're not too far below the melting point of iron. And there were 3 or 4 deaths in 1955, and Kervran had faced this problem for 20 years, and he said, this is it. I'm getting to the bottom of this no matter what. And he had a high enough rank in the health department that he could commandeer different expertise, different specialties, and he had them do all these different things. First of all, they never found a source of carbon monoxide in any of these workplaces. All of the welders, they tested all the welders, whether or not they had died. Well, hard to test them after the fact, but all of the welders had high CO in their blood. They also tested co-workers. There were helpers who worked in the area but not close to the welding, the high iron and the air heated by that iron. No co-working nearby had high carbon monoxide. The remote air for the welders solved the problem. The explanation, nitrogen can become carbon monoxide if you have just one proton and one neutron go from one nitrogen atom to the other. The one that gets the added proton and neutron becomes oxygen. They then have 8 protons and neutrons instead of 7. And the other one now has 6, which is carbon monoxide. One proton and neutron move from one nucleus to the other. And he says probably under the influence of an enzyme in the body, which he didn't have time enough in his lifetime to identify. The 6th proton and neutron of an atom's nucleus are not bound as tightly. We don't talk as much about the nucleus, but the nucleus is also not just a stationary thing. The nuclei of nitrogen, the 2 molecules together, are 1.11 angstroms apart. This is a very small distance, 1/10 of micron, or 1,000th of a micron. Someone may correct me on that. I think that's it. And then versus 0.108, very slight difference. And then when helium was substituted for nitrogen, no more carbon monoxide poisoning occurred. Further tests showed oxygen pressure was not the cause. This was by other scientists. That was another theory. Well, it must be oxygen pressure causing the carbon to unite with the oxygen. And the resonance frequencies of red hot iron, this is heated to this very high temperature, match those of carbon monoxide, wavelength of 8 microns at that temperature. So we have these resonance frequencies triggering this movement of one proton and neutron. Yes?
So were those welders given helium to breathe?
No, they were given, well, if you give people too much helium, what? Yeah, their voice, yeah, that's right. I'm not sure exactly how they did that experiment, but nitrogen is basically inert, and so is helium, except for this thing it does to your voice. I'm not sure how they did it, maybe in the blood.
You don't know whether they pumped more helium into the air or
I don't.
got rid of the nitrogen.
I don't. I apologize for that. Here's another experiment, and this is why these transmutations, I'm convinced, can be proved by a very compelling degree, because they can do experiments involving a short time period and a very controllable environment. It's harder to control the environment of a human or even a chicken. But if you can take yeast, as the Japanese microbiologist did, for example, Aspergillus niger, Penicillium chrysogenum, brewer's yeast, and torula yeast, some of them were cultured with potassium present. And the question is whether sodium could be combined with oxygen to produce potassium. Again, the atomic numbers match and add up to the atomic number of calcium, which is 40. Sodium, 23. Oxygen has 16, atomic weight of 16, atomic number of 8. And 23 plus 16 is 39, which is the molecular weight of potassium, and these numbers match. The beginning amount was 0.41 of potassium, which isn't very much, 0.41. The end result was, when they had a little bit of potassium present, you got a much bigger result, all the way up to 22 milligrams, and that means 54 times more potassium at the end of the experiment than there was 3 days earlier. Without potassium, there wasn't as much, and a Nobel laureate did research to show why, and the result was that potassium would actually block an enzyme that would interfere with this reaction of sodium to potassium. And there was something in these yeasts that had a catalytic effect to cause this combination of the sodium with oxygen to produce potassium. And other tests that can be done involve sprouting grains. Kervin did a number of these where within a few days, like 72 hours, there are marked differences in sprouting grains between the amount of elements in the seed or the proportions and those in the sprout. Here's a study that was done on the formation of limestone out of sandstone. Again, that's calcium out of silica, which I'm presenting because it is analogous to what's going on in the human body, apparently, with horsetail as the source of silica. The Angkor Wat Monument in Cambodia, composed largely of sandstone, silicon oxide, silicon dioxide, silicates. Part of the monument appeared to be changing from silicon dioxide to calcium carbonate. Kervin investigated this. He had a prominent position in the health department. Again, he was able to get a number of experts, including to go down to Cambodia. The sandstone contains much silica as quartz and feldspar, little calcium. Certain areas were infected with bacteria, appeared to be turning into limestone, and here were the findings. Normal stone, silicon 63, calcium very low. Deteriorated stone from the bacteria, suddenly silica has dropped to almost by half, and calcium has multiplied by many times with the proportion of the change roughly comparable. The hypothesis, silicon with a molecular weight of 28 plus carbon 12 equals calcium at 40. Same thing in human physiology, of course. Calcium was the same before and after. Theory was, well, it's coming from rainwater. The magnesium in the healthy stone was 2.5%. It was very slightly changed in the deteriorated stones, and potassium was completely unchanged. So the rainwater was not the source of this problem. And then they found microorganisms. Of these samples, most of them contained these bacteria, all in the deteriorated stone, none from the healthy stone. 7 species actinomycetes, all belonging to the genus Streptomyces. The actinomycetes were much more abundant in the stones which showed the most deterioration. They have an important role in the process of deterioration. Calcium increased 11-fold, 1.4 to 17.34, without any detectable calcium supplied externally by water. Here's the theory. Through enzymatic action, 2 elements can combine to make a third element. An element can be split into 2 elements. As measured, these reactions occur at low energies, higher than energies from chemical reactions, but lower than those involved in nuclear reactions. Examples: silicon plus carbon, calcium. This is another one I mentioned, and a third, potassium. These all involve calcium. And then sodium plus oxygen is potassium. And a Greek physicist has shown that some of the anomalies and problems in figuring out what's going on with sodium intake and potassium are related to a transmutation that occurs normally in the human body, and that we need a certain amount of sodium, and the hormone aldosterone actually catalyzes a conversion of sodium to potassium and maybe to magnesium as well. And that may be another way besides sweating and evaporation from sweat that helps keep us cool. Kervin did quite a bit of research on that with workers on oil derricks in the Sahara Desert. And he found that they would increase their intake of sodium, and over a period of weeks, they measured all their intake and their output. And they were producing a lot more potassium and magnesium, but not sodium. And so there was this disappearance of sodium and this appearance, apparently, of magnesium and potassium. And they were able to maintain body temperature quite well. And then sodium plus hydrogen, magnesium. That's this other one I just mentioned. What about drugs for osteoporosis? The bisphosphonates, Boniva, Sally Field, has advertised that. We've all seen that ad. Fosamax, Actonel. How many have taken some of these drugs? Dead jaw. It alters the calcium in blood. Calcium needs to be at a very constant level in the blood. And that's for probably maintaining metabolism in various ways that aren't totally understood. But if you get too low calcium in the blood, that's not good. Can affect health in a number of ways. Same thing with excess calcium. And so it's important to maintain it at a very steady level. And Evista also is another drug. Anyone take Evista? Nobody? Well, that's good, because one of the side effects includes death. So the osteoblasts in bone build bone, adding new calcium. The osteoclasts in bone break down bone, removing old calcium. And these drugs, the bisphosphonates here, are designed to stop or slow the removing of old calcium. The body does both these processes every day, constantly. It's always removing old calcium. It's breaking down calcium from old bones and building new bone with the osteoblasts to replace it. And we don't want to interfere with that process, or we end up with dead jaw, okay? And other bones become brittle and weak in that way. And of course, we also, when we take this hormone, you're breaking down bone and you're stopping this removal of old calcium, but you're disrupting the regulation of your blood calcium level. Another book I've got here that's very good is called Preventing and Reversing Osteoporosis by two very good researchers. They don't get into the transmutations theory, but they cite a lot of research that shows there are a lot of elements and nutrients that are important for healthy bones. It's not just one mineral or a few minerals. You see here, of course, vitamin D we know about, which is interfered with by calcium, the conversion of the active form into the active form of vitamin D. Vitamin K, B6, B12, folic acid, vitamin E, vitamin F, omega-3s in particular, protein. Lysine is one of the essential amino acids. That's very helpful in making strong cells generally. Bioflavonoids and vitamin C make strong cells. They help with bone. And then we talked about these elements that are how we apparently make calcium. And there may be an argument for strontium as well. There was actually a report in the Navy, and there was this one a study of dental caries, and there was one group that had 0 dental caries, and they were all from one county in Ohio, and it turned out they had high levels of strontium in the water. This is not radioactive strontium, but strontium, and people have found that there's some studies showing that supplemental strontium will actually help increase bones. Although I personally prefer these 3 elements here. And silicon and magnesium, and they're all very inexpensive and readily available, health food stores. Iodine, and that may be indirect because it helps with thyroid hormones that may have a big role to play in these transmutations. Selenium is actually very important for iodine to work properly. And some people can have low thyroid because they're deficient in selenium. Selenium also is the core mineral for the immune system, and there's evidence that it may help completely reverse AIDS as long as people get a full range of nutrients. Manganese, copper, zinc, boron, which helps with hormones, and then iron. So there are many things that help with calcium, and so I recommend a whole foods diet. Don't eat refined junk food, very deficient in minerals.
So when you say a whole food diet, does that exclude being a vegan or vegetarian?
It does not require a vegetarian diet.
No, I'm saying does it exclude it?
Does it exclude?
So when you say a whole food diet, does that exclude being a vegan?
It does not exclude a vegetarian diet. It does not exclude a vegan diet.
Well, you use the term.
There may be problems with a vegan diet in
diet.
terms of a nutrient like B12. Could be a problem with protein. It could be problems that don't show up for a long time. And we had a forum program by a lady who I don't see here today, but she had this problem herself after years and developed serious problems. And it was very hard to reverse and restore normal protein levels. But it was only after a period of years on a vegan type diet or vegetarian diet that she developed these symptoms, and she's helped other people with that problem. I forget the details, but deficient protein can cause a lot of problems. And it's not that you need huge amounts of protein, but we do need a certain amount of it. And eight essential amino acids are probably important for that. A vegetarian diet for me didn't work because I found I was very sensitive to wheat and was also sensitive to other cereal grains. Granted, I was never diagnosed as allergic as a child, but I think I was mildly sensitive to those, and it became worse over time, which can happen if you're exposed to the same allergen. And I also became sensitive to legumes. And one way vegetarians get adequate protein is have maybe 1/3 legumes or 1 part legumes and 3 parts cereal grains, and the amino acids balance. But if you're allergic to both those things, that's not so good. And I also found that I was sensitive to dairy products. That was back 42 years ago in 1975. And so for me, a vegetarian diet did not work. And I found through elimination testing, which is a very valid way of testing for food allergies, that I did better with what is now being called a paleo diet or caveman diet that avoids grains, cereal grasses, members of the grass family, legumes, and milk products. And I've, in many ways, I'm probably in the best health I've been in my life. Meat, fish, eggs. Calcium causes nerves and muscles to contract. That's very good because that's how they do work. However, magnesium causes them to relax. And before they can do more work, they have to relax, contract and relax, contract and relax. So if you're consuming milk products that contain 8 times as much calcium as magnesium, you're generating a daily imbalance. And how do you overcome that? Stop consuming milk products. And I've achieved extraordinary results by having people totally stop dairy products. And it's helped me. In fact, I had 2 bad falls on ice after I had been totally avoiding dairy products when I finally really read that Harvard nurses study back in when I published what would have been my thesis in 2006. 4 years later, I'm totally free of calcium supplements and dairy products for 4 years. I had 2 hard falls on concrete, slipping on ice. Fell on my jaw on one occasion and fell on my ribs on the other. Nothing broke. And I've seen people consuming dairy products bump something or have a minor fall like that, and they've got multiple fractures of an ankle or hip or some other part of their body. And this affects other things, muscles, okay? If your muscles are exposed to excess calcium, they're going to be tighter and less flexible and more prone to tearing and pulling. And since I've done this, I find I'm very immune to injuries from sports activity. I play tennis, and you have to accelerate very fast, stop very fast, turn. And I seem to do that very well without any risk of pulling, tearing, that sort of thing. And I see other people my age who are hobbling around and getting hip and knee replacement. And here are some of the symptoms and disorders caused by too much calcium. Pain, arthritis. The medical doctor I mentioned had a 93-year-old patient who came to him and said, "I'm in so much pain. I want you to cure me or I want you to kill me." And he asked her, "Well, do you take any calcium?" He had read my article and he really liked it. And as I said, he did his senior thesis at Harvard as an undergraduate on calcium. And so this really resonated with him when I showed him my article. And she said, "No, well, what do you take?" "Well, I take Tums." Well, Tums, one tablet, 500 milligrams of calcium. So she was getting 2 or more of those a day. He said, "Stop taking Tums." And she came back a few weeks later and said, "Doc, I'm feeling great. You don't have to kill me anymore." Another thing you get is tetany, muscle cramps, muscle spasms, stiffness. And I had a friend, we were driving to a conference in Las Vegas, and he was in such pain from cramping that he said, "I got to go back. I can't do this." And I happened to have some magnesium capsules with me, gave him 2 500 milligram capsules. Within 10 minutes, he says, I'm fine. So we went on with our trip. I used to drink a lot of milk as a kid, and I got a few fractures, and I used to get cramps at night. Doesn't happen to me anymore. Tight, inflexible muscles, prone to injury, tears, stretches, etc. How many athletes are told to drink a lot of milk? Including those of you who know anything about the Denver Broncos. Terrell Davis was, the MVP, a running back, and he couldn't heal a fracture. And he was on that milk mustache program, take milk for your bones. He couldn't heal a simple hairline fracture. Had to give up his career after 4 or 5 years. Weak, painful joints, poorly lubricated joints, bad backs, stones, kidney, gallbladder, calcium deposits, bone spurs, often quite painful, depression, irritability. Imagine, our brain has nerves that are active. If you got too much calcium and these nerves are contracting and they can't relax, can you cause depression because the brain stops functioning? I think so. Hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism. I had a client who had a serious thyroid problem, and she was very upset, just constant feeling of stress. And I said, well, are you taking a lot of calcium? This is a legal client, so my advice had nothing to do with her legal case. But I told her I had this sideline, okay? And it was a family law case, so it was causing lots of problems with her kids, with her ex-husband, and she was drinking something like 3 glasses of milk a day, following the usual advice. And I said, I advise you to cut back in that. Her doctor had prescribed a hefty dose of thyroid for her. Within a couple of weeks, she was feeling much better, much more relaxed. And she went back to her doctor, and the doctor cut her dose by 2/3. So you don't need all that thyroid, just by cutting back all this calcium intake. And the doctor retested her a 1.5 years later, waited a long time to test her, and said, you don't need any supplemental thyroid. And how many thyroid patients are taking thyroid because it's not necessary? And I had a friend who was athletic, about my age, and he experienced severe depression, and he'd been consuming milk products quite a bit. Okay, prostate cancer, breast cancer, those are specific studies, but there's reason to think that high calcium intake can lead to higher rates of cancer. Adele Davis, have any of you heard of her? She died of bone cancer. Recommended consuming high amounts of calcium, milk products. Heart attacks, arrhythmias. You're messing with the electrical action involved in nerves, and the heart is controlled by that. That's been one of the findings, I think, of that big study in Sweden, was that, and several other studies, that high calcium intake is associated with higher rates of serious heart problems. So in summary, for strong bones, low calcium, stronger, healthier bones, avoid refined foods. Refined sugar is very deficient in these elements we need. Magnesium. 99% of magnesium is lost in refined cane sugar. So if you see cane sugar and think, oh, that's good, it's not GMO corn, or it's not high fructose corn syrup, don't eat it. It's missing 99% of the magnesium that you need for bones and 300 enzymatic actions in the body related to all kinds of functions. So don't eat refined sugar or flour. Again, enormous loss of nutrients in both of those. Now, I don't eat flour because I don't eat grains. I don't have to think about that so much. If bones are broken, take a silica supplement such as horsetail and magnesium. Potassium wouldn't hurt either. Take more magnesium than calcium if you supplement with calcium at all. The recommendations 40 years ago were take twice as much calcium as magnesium. And I think that's been completely invalidated. Yes?
Almond milks and the silk, is that,
I missed the first part?
okay, the almond milk or the silk that's in the dairy product, is that something you can substitute?
The almond milks and the silk.
Yes, I think
is
it
that,
can.
is
I missed the first part.
Okay, the
Yeah,
almond
milk.
or
if,
the
people
silk
didn't hear that.
that's in the dairy product, is that something that you can substitute
I don't
for
recommend soy
regular
milk. Soy is somewhat higher in calcium, and it contains hormones that some physicians I respect recommend against. Yes.
Hi, yeah, I have a couple questions. I don't know what tetany means.
Tetany is muscle cramping.
Oh, okay. And I get migraine headaches, and my doctor has told me to take several pills, calcium pills a day. So, I don't know. I wonder if there's any correlation there.
Well, yes, the question is, she has migraine headaches, and her doctor recommends calcium for that. How much?
Well, a lot. At least 3,000 milligrams a day of calcium pills. So, but and she's not correlated that at all. I mean, that's just
Right.
for my diet because I have low calcium in my bones.
Yeah, based, I assume, on these mineral density tests that, yeah. No, I've had people told that, and they find they do much better when they cut back in calcium and take these other elements. Yeah. Also,
Is there any correlation with the migraines? Who knows?
I'm not, I don't have a firm opinion on it, but I would think it possibly could be. As I mentioned, excess calcium causes nerves to contract, and that's in the brain as well. If you don't have a balancing amount of magnesium, how do those nerves continue to function optimally? I don't know. So, I mean, I'm not a doctor, so but I think it wouldn't hurt to experiment with magnesium, and food allergies are proven to be a common cause of migraines. You can get inflammation from food allergy, and inflammation can cause virtually any kind of problem. Arthritis is inflammation, inflamed joints, ileitis, inflamed small intestine, so forth. So that's another factor that can be very important. Yes, and then
So just a quick question. If this research has been around for the last 40, 50 years, why are we still getting recommendations from doctors and people, the doctors, the medical profession, to be increasing calcium and so forth? What's the counterbalance there within the medical community that is still hawking, if you will, calcium as opposed to other possibilities?
the question was, why is it taking so long for this information that's been around a long time? Of course, the Harvard Nurses Study was published just 20 years ago. Okay, yeah, 20 years, right.
And especially as women, I mean, I think this is the other piece of it. The whole deal about hormone replacement, the whole deal about, whatever, about cholesterol levels. There's a lot of research out there, but it doesn't seem to be, is it because, as you said earlier, that it depends on the organism, each individual organism, and how, basically, what the platform is there?
Well, my answer to that is that it's known that major advances in science tend to proceed very slowly. And the bigger the change from orthodox thinking, the longer it takes. There's a wonderful book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn, K-U-H-N. He was professor of science history at Harvard. I went to Yale, by the way, so I have no personal feelings against Harvard. In fact, yeah. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he showed that in science, peer review and the conventional way science is run is pretty good at incremental changes, little changes, but it's not good at big changes. There tends to be a lot of resistance. This goes against basic teaching, okay? So that's part of it. When we talk about calcium here, this is a fundamental change. Another problem is that medical doctors receive almost no training in nutrition, okay, in medical school. They're lucky if they get 1 hour, and we're not talking semester hour, where they meet once a week for 12 weeks or whatever. We're talking 60 minutes of their time. Oh, we're going to teach you about nutrition. You know, I've been studying this for 46 years, and I was a practicing lawyer, but I spent huge amounts of time reading this stuff because I could see enormous effects on health if people would pay attention to this. Linus Pauling, the only person ever to win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, greatest chemist of the 20th century, got very interested in nutrition later in his life. And he wrote an article arguing that the way we should approach medicine is to find out what makes healthy people healthy and do that.
Not just study the sick.
Yeah. And this brings me to another reason for resistance, and that is there is money. There is money in dairy products. There is money in drugs. Bisphonates, you know, like these anti-osteoporosis drugs. And they have a heavy influence on the National Institutes of Health that make these recommendations. So there are all these layers that interfere with progress in science.
I just want to say, you know, since I talked to you a few weeks ago, I stopped eating basically milk products, cheese particularly, almost entirely. And I've always had kind of borderline blood pressure. And I swear it dropped 20 points. You know, just,
And it's right where it should be, right?
yeah, it's right where it should be. But the other thing I think about, though, is when you have a little bit of blood pressure problem, they always talk about sodium. They say avoid sodium. And I'm wondering, what's your view of sodium?
Okay. Larry said that he talked to me a couple of weeks ago, and we ran into each other by accident. And I recommend that he cut out calcium completely. And he's been doing that, and he said his blood pressure came down, was it 20 points? Yeah, 20 points, which is dramatic, and he's always had borderline high blood pressure. And it's now like 120? Or? That's normal. Yeah, that's very significant. And never normal before. Well, that's right. Okay, and the other point was?
Well, so, you know, what they always talk to you about is sodium. And you go,
Oh, yes.
wash out the sodium, the salt.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if that is a big factor in blood pressure or not. Of course, maybe cheese has sodium.
Not as much, because we need a certain amount of sodium. You know, there's a certain level of sodium in the blood at all times, very steady. It's like calcium, you know, what they call homeostasis. We need a very steady level. And it appears that Kervin is absolutely right about sodium, that sodium can be converted to potassium. Sodium's in the blood, and then through enzymatic reaction, aldosterone, which is an adrenal hormone, and you end up with potassium inside the cell. And no one's ever been able to adequately explain. They call it the sodium-potassium pump in medicine. And this Greek physicist did some very good research with that. And my own experience is that I do quite well having a certain amount of like sea salt. And there are a lot of trace elements in sea salt, very micro elements that have very valuable uses in physiology. And so I think that the emphasis on zero sodium is misplaced. Food allergies can play a big role. I had a legal client of mine. It was an immigration issue, but he had a DUI that was interfering with that, and so I gave him some nutritional advice, okay? And what caught me, the red flag was that when he was arrested for DUI, he was in the jail unit and his blood pressure was very high, okay? And he told me, I only had a couple of beers. I was celebrating my son's, I had dinner, I had a full meal, which slows the alcohol into your blood. I had maybe 2 beers over 2 hours, and I wasn't drunk at all. But he had this big spike in blood pressure, okay, over 200, maybe higher than that, because he told me that he'd been taking blood pressure medicine for several years, and it never could bring his blood pressure down below about 200 over 100. And a leading pioneer in food allergies named Randolph in Chicago showed that people who are alcoholics are allergic to the food that their favorite alcohol is made from. They may not be allergic to alcohol at all. They're allergic to the food, which contains proteins that are the source of allergen, that their favorite food is made from. And this client had beer. He told me he had beer. And then he has this big, dangerous spike in his blood pressure that was picked up at the jail. So I recommended that he totally avoid members of the grass family that are found in beer. Rice, corn, barley, and he totally avoided them. And before that, he'd been taking this medication. It wouldn't bring his blood pressure down that much. He would meditate, and he showed me these studies that showed you could bring down your blood pressure by 5 points by meditating, maybe 10 points. And then he followed my advice. He totally avoided cereal grains for 4 days, okay? Because it takes that long to get a food out of your system, so you're no longer allergic, reacting allergically to it. Longer if you're extremely, extremely sensitive. And his blood pressure dropped from 210 or 200 over 100 down to 143 over 100 in 4 days, no cereal grains, suggesting allergy, inflammation, and there's a part of the kidney that affects blood pressure, controls it. And if you have inflammation in that part of the kidney, your blood pressure goes haywire. Okay, so Joseph.
Thank you, Earl, for your very informative and clear presentation and for all your extensive research and study. And when you were presenting, it made me think about the dairy industry. Why they won't speak about it, because there are billions of dollars invested and they don't want their industry challenged, similar to the vaccine industry or the pharmaceutical industry, even though the evidence is readily available. If people haven't read the China study by Colin Campbell, Dr. Colin Campbell, I highly recommend that. Earl mentioned that book. And I have some DVDs here on health and nutrition and other things. If you're interested, come by the table right here by the door. So my question to you is, those examples you gave where you recommended horsetail and magnesium, did those MDs respond and acknowledge what happened to their patients, how they rapidly healed, or did they just try to brush it under the carpet?
My understanding is that the clients didn't actually tell the doctor. And my experience is that when they do, the doctors sometimes say that's very interesting, but they don't do much about it, or they disbelieve it. It goes against everything they've been taught. They may need to see that and hear that 5 times, 10 times, and then they say, wait. There is a book talking about, is there progress? I forget the name, but I put it in the announcement. But there's a book, The Calcium Lie, Part 1, The Calcium Lie, Part 2, by a medical doctor. And he doesn't get into biological transmutations, but he does show these very glaring contradictions between conventional wisdom about calcium, how high calcium is not good for bones and has many other harmful side effects. Yes?
Is high vitamin D supplementation a recommendation to improve bone density? I have a friend who said her doctor put her on a high vitamin D supplement. I don't remember the amount. And she said she saw a big improvement in her bone mineral density. I hadn't heard about that before.
I missed the last part of that. What was the effect on her bone density?
Her friend who said her bone mineral density improved a lot after taking high vitamin D supplementation.
Okay. Well, subject to my reservations about
was the effect on her bone density?
Exactly what
who said her
bone mineral density test mean.
improved a lot.
Yes, vitamin D is very important for bones.
Vitamin D supplementation.
But as I said, it's just one of many factors. But when you say high vitamin D, if people go outdoors, which I recommend, without glasses or sunglasses, and without sunscreen, sunscreen blocks the formation of vitamin D. And many of them contain chemicals that can be carcinogenic. So you get those into your bloodstream and into the skin as well. That's not so good. I haven't used sunscreen now for about 42 years. And I've outlived my father by 11 years. He died of cancer. And my older brother by 5 years, he died of cancer. They covered up, used sunscreen and all that stuff. Vitamin D is perhaps the most protective element against cancer, all cancers. And skin cancer is the least fatal of all cancers. And my father died of melanoma, which is the only dangerous form of skin cancer. And an Australian study showed that the people who worked outdoors had less melanoma than average. It was a protective effect to work outdoors. And the highest risk factor were people who worked indoors under fluorescent lights for more than 10 years. My father, okay? And where do they get the melanomas? Not on their skin, exposed to the sun. They tend to get them behind the knee, and his were wrapped around his intestines, inoperable. And he wore glasses all the time. He was very farsighted. And the light that comes through your eyes actually has very important effects in regulating and stimulating normal hormone production. And I mentioned thyroid hormones, adrenal hormones, sex hormones, like estrogen plays a significant role in production of bone. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious what you thought about that.
Yeah. The source of the information about light, one of the best sources on that is our books and a wonderful film by John Ott, O-T-T. The book is called Health and Light. And I've talked to people who said, my grandmother in Morocco grandfather lived to be 110 years old, and they were outdoors all the time. I agree with what you're saying. that kind of thing.
You said to avoid soy milk. Do you also suggest avoiding tofu?
Tofu is fermented and processed, and it may be depending on the source, because soy in this country is commercial soy. There's no way to know it's not GMO, genetically modified, and there's so many chemicals that have changed in GMO foods that our body has never historically adapted to, that I think it's the cause of a major jump in food allergies and things like that. So if you could get totally organic tofu, I don't think I'd probably have a problem with it.
You were talking about the China study, and to follow up on her comment about vitamin D. In rural areas all over the world, people are getting more vitamin D because they're outside and they're getting exercise, and you haven't really mentioned that. And talk a little bit about exercise, please.
Yeah, exercise is definitely helpful. Too much exercise may not be particularly, because you're taxing your bone-making, bone-preserving resources to some extent with very excessive. And the Australian study I mentioned does go into that factor. They measured for that. I was going to say another thing about what is too much, because your question about vitamin D is very important. There are indications that people maybe should get 5,000 or 10,000 units of vitamin D a day, okay? And some may be so deficient they need a lot more than that. If you go outdoors on a day like today, near the solstice, and even for months before and after that, you can pick up 20,000 units of vitamin D in 20 minutes or so, according to the research. Now late in the day or too early in the day, you don't get as much. But also late in the day and earlier in the day, you still get a lot of infrared, and that also is very helpful for bone formation. Phenomenal results with increased bone formation with full spectrum light, including ultraviolet. You don't want to be wearing sunglasses that block ultraviolet. And that plays, regular glasses block a majority of ultraviolet.
And contact lenses?
They block ultraviolet also. In fact, if it's plastic, which I believe most contact lenses are, they actually put a chemical in the plastic. Same thing with eyeglasses. They put a chemical to block all ultraviolet. And one of the major manufacturers, Bosch and Lomb, used to make lenses with plastic that was not treated with this chemical. And I used to buy those because that emits most of the ultraviolet. And one of the consequences of blocking ultraviolet is that that's the wavelength that the pupil primarily responds to shrink the pupil, to protect you from all of the bright light, all of the wavelengths. Because too much green, too much yellow is not good for your eyes. That's why people squint if they can't do it. But if you don't have glasses on, your pupils will naturally shrink. And if you haven't done that, try it for 10 to 15 minutes and you'll find your pupils adjust and you're actually comfortable where you thought you wouldn't be before. That happened to me. I used to think I had to wear sunglasses before I first learned about this light thing, and again, that was 1975.
Well, how long during the period of the day is 5,000 to 10,000 units of vitamin D? How long a period of the day would that be, say like at 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
Probably, you'd probably get that in,
5 minutes?
well, I recommend more than that. But you don't want to burn. Burning damages the skin, okay? There's a vitamin, PABA, P-A-B-A, or para-amino benzoic acid, that protects people against sun and allows the body to convert this light energy to useful nutrients. It's somewhat analogous to folic acid, oddly enough. But paraminobenzoic acid in amounts of 500 to 1,000 milligrams has helped some people that would always burn with sun to tan and not burn. So
I wanted to ask something or say something too. There's a wonderful movie on Netflix and it's called What the Health, and it's like an expose. I would highly recommend it.
What the Health? She's recommending a book, and it's on where?
On Netflix?
Netflix. Okay. Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to confirm, as far as doctors giving you nutritional information, I was recently told by a doctor not to take the, vitamin D3, and so I purposely did not tell the doctor how much I was taking because I knew that that would not be okay. So they're not even up on the latest information about how important, especially if you have a profession where you work inside. So I just didn't tell her everything and continue doing what I know is right with vitamin D3.
Yeah. Did everybody hear that? Okay. She's saying that her doctor doesn't agree with taking large amounts of vitamin D, so she would just not tell her doctor. I guess she doesn't want to lose that doctor, right? So why get in a big argument about something that they're simply not open to? Yeah. Let's take one more question. We need to actually get out of here.
Mine isn't related, it's kind of an overall thing, so if somebody else has a health question.
No, I think that...
Is that it? No, throughout your talk today, I kept thinking of Vincent Carroll with the Denver Post, because he had an article a week or so ago about how all the people who are protesting humans being allowed into Rocky Flats are crazy and so on and so forth. And I just think he's nuts, because there's so much, we get so much information that's wrong, as you've described over and over again, as has everybody in the audience. I go back to the nurses' study for hormone replacement therapy. For 60 years, they recommended hormone replacement therapy for women, and then they did that study and found out it was causing breast cancer and wasn't protecting against. I mean, they were experimenting on women.
But that was one kind with postmenopausal who hadn't been taking it before. That was the other piece of that was so ironic, is that it wasn't everything for everybody. It was one particular kind, and that's the kind of misinformation that we get. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so on this Rocky Flats thing, on food advice, I mean, you really don't know where to turn for a lot of things, and you have to be totally skeptical, and I'm surprised, I guess I'm not surprised that he isn't, but I think the people who are protesting have more of a leg to stand on than he does.
Yes.
Editorial opinion.
Yeah, she's quoting an editorial writer with the Denver Post, Vincent Carroll, and saying that he thinks these people are nuts who advise people not to go to Rocky Flats because of potential exposures to radioactive things. And I think Vincent Carroll's wrong about that, very definitely, yeah. All right, I said one more question, but let's go with Nancy here.
Okay, so taking a silica supplement like horsetail, how much magnesium do you take with that, and how much vitamin B1 if you're trying to heal broken bones, and what if you're doing something for maintenance? So, you're saying that you should take magnesium with calcium, but what's the relation, or proportion or ratio of silica to magnesium? If you're taking it for broken bones, and if you're just going to take some for maintenance, what's the ratio?
Okay, well, for broken bones with horsetail, I think they're 500 milligrams per capsule. I recommended a brand. I have no interest financial ever in any supplements, but for example, Nature's Way brand is just pure horsetail, that's it. And I like that. And I recommended, I think, 2 or 3 per meal, 3 meals a day, so 6 to 9. And I think that's what these people I mentioned who had very rapid healing despite very low estrogen levels. And it appears that in younger women with high estrogen levels, they don't lose bone. That this, and I'm wondering if it isn't because, and I've never seen anyone discuss this, but in this transmutation issue, does estrogen allow converting calcium to magnesium or into silica so it can then be absorbed into bone? I mean, there may be something like that going on with estrogen. No one's researched that yet, but I think it ought to be researched. And I did mention in my announcement that it's possible to do definitive studies that would prove this one way or the other, and that is to use isotopes of silica and magnesium. And then when you see this increase in bone, you're going to see an increase in a different isotope of calcium because it comes from a different isotope of magnesium or silica or potassium. And there is at least one isotope study. It wasn't with calcium, it was with another experiment, but it did show a transmutation. Very possible to do studies like that.
Earl, can I do one more quick thing? And I've heard, and I don't know the full scale of it, but I've heard that the nutrient industry isn't very highly regulated, so there's a lot of bunk nutrients on the market. How does one go about figuring out a brand that is reliable? That's it. That's the question.
Yeah.
I've heard that there's not a whole lot of like regulation testing to make sure that people are actually selling what they're claiming that they're selling, and I've heard fillers. I've heard stories of fillers being in certain brands, and that there's not a lot of oversight when it comes to the nutrient industry.
All right. Well.
You mean supplements?
Yeah, supplements, nutrients, vitamins, all that stuff.
Yeah, my general practice is to go to a place like Natural Grocers, where I think they have quite high quality with the supplements they generally purchase and sell. Brands like Centrum, I would not trust. The more commercial brands. But I don't have a lot of detailed information. I go for the more natural, no additives, natural sources. With vitamin C, you can get sodium ascorbate, but like Now brand is very inexpensive and reasonable, but it's from corn, and so I find that that's not as good as if I can get, there's Ecology Action, or Nutricology has pure vitamin C crystals. That means it's the acidic form and not buffered. And that's from, I think, sago palm, which is less allergenic. And I'm somewhat sensitive to corn, so I prefer that. But then I buffer it, and I buffer it with sodium carbonate, about 1 part vitamin C, 2 or 3 parts vitamin C crystals, that's the acidic form, to 1 part sodium bicarbonate. Then it's buffered. You don't want to take high amounts of ascorbic acid, the acidic form of vitamin C, over 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams, or the acid will eat up your small intestines. I did that once, and God, my intestines hurt for a couple hours before they calmed down again. But in a buffered form, no problem at all.
What would be the daily maintenance doses for horsetail, silica, and magnesium that you would recommend?
Okay, well, personally, I don't take a daily, like horsetail. There are foods that are high in silica. If you are wanting to do a daily, I would think 2 or 3 capsules a day, maybe. Not that much, in other words. You can get silica from foods like cucumbers and other members of the squash family, like zucchini, the summer type squash, yellow crookneck squash. And I think a lot of seeds and nuts have magnesium and silicon in it. A lot of natural fruits and vegetables have potassium in it. Gelatin contains generous amounts of silicon. You've all heard of the term silica gel, right? Silica readily makes gelatin-like substances. And so I recommend people don't skim off or throw away the fat from like a chicken or other meat. People need a certain amount of saturated fat in their diet. It makes the immune system work better. It helps regulate blood sugar better instead of relying on carbohydrates. And then the silica in the soft tissue, that's what makes joints very flexible. And so the silica is good as silica in joints, and it's good for bones by its conversion to calcium by combining with carbon. So you get a double benefit there.